In 1913, as the great European powers competed not only for territory but also for speed, steel, and naval supremacy, a warship emerged in the Baltic Sea that redefined what it meant to be fast. Its name was the Russian destroyer Novik. And for a brief moment in history, it was considered the fastest warship in the world. But Novik was more than a speed record. It became a symbol of an Imperial Russian Navy struggling to recover from recent humiliation, modernize its fleet, and prove that it could still compete with Europe's major maritime powers. This is the real story of a destroyer that marked an era, born at the end of an empire and launched amid the rising tensions that would soon lead to the First World War. After the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, the Imperial Russian Navy was in a critical condition. The defeat at the Battle of Tsushima had devastated not only ships but also Russia's international prestige. Reconstruction was essential. Modernization was urgent. Credibility had to be restored. The Russian naval rearmament program of the early 20th century placed strong emphasis on technological innovation. Among its most ambitious projects was the development of a destroyer capable of combining exceptional speed with effective offensive power. Novik was launched in 1911 and commissioned in 1913. It represented a new generation of destroyers, vessels designed not merely for escort duties, but for aggressive offensive operations such as torpedo attacks, advanced reconnaissance, and rapid fleet engagement. What truly distinguished Novik was its speed. During sea trials, the ship reached approximately 37.3 knots, an extraordinary figure for the period. At the time, this made it faster than any other operational warship in the world. To understand the importance of this achievement, it is necessary to remember that naval speed in the early 20th century meant decisive tactical advantage. A faster destroyer could choose when to engage or withdraw. It could pursue enemy vessels, or escape overwhelming forces. Novik was not simply fast. It was tactically transformative. Its design incorporated modern steam turbine technology, developed through international technical cooperation as Russia sought to accelerate its naval modernization. The ship's elongated hull was optimized for performance, prioritizing maximum speed while maintaining meaningful offensive capability. Armed with medium-caliber guns and torpedo tubes, Novik was ideally suited for fast strikes against larger enemy ships. It embodied the transition from traditional naval warfare toward a new era defined by speed, maneuverability, and nighttime attack operations. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Novik was already in active service in the Baltic Sea, where it would face not only technical and operational challenges, but also the brutal realities of a total war that would ultimately transform, and soon destroy, the Imperial Russian Empire. When the First World War began in August 1914, the Russian destroyer Novik was already regarded as one of the most modern assets of the Imperial Russian Navy's Baltic Fleet. The Baltic Sea quickly became one of the most tense naval theaters of the conflict, as Russian and German forces competed for control of strategic routes, minefields, and access to the vulnerable coastlines of the empire. Novik operated in an environment where speed meant survival. The Baltic was not an open ocean. It was a relatively confined maritime space filled with islands, narrow straits, and shallow waters. Minefields became essential weapons for both sides, while submarines began playing an increasingly important role. Naval warfare was changing before the eyes of the sailors who fought there. Within this context, Novik had a clear mission: aggressive reconnaissance, escort of larger fleet units, and rapid attacks against German vessels whenever opportunities arose. Its superior speed allowed it to conduct forward patrols and return quickly to base. During Baltic operations, destroyers often operated ahead of cruisers and battleships, identifying enemy movements and protecting heavier ships from torpedo attacks. Novik took part in numerous offensive and defensive operations against German naval forces. Its performance reinforced its reputation not only as an exceptionally fast vessel, but also as a reliable combat platform. The combination of modern steam turbines and a hydrodynamically efficient hull provided a genuine advantage during pursuits. In encounters with German destroyers, the ability to accelerate rapidly could determine which side chose the moment of engagement. But speed came at a cost. The turbines required constant maintenance, and fuel consumption at high speed was significant. Operating close to mechanical limits placed heavy strain on the ship's systems. Even so, Novik represented a technological leap forward for Russia. The ship became the foundation for an entire series of subsequent destroyers, later known as the Novik-class destroyers, which adopted similar concepts of high speed and effective armament. This class would influence later Russian and eventually Soviet naval designs. As the war progressed, the internal situation within the Russian Empire grew increasingly unstable. Military pressure, heavy casualties, and economic hardship fueled rising social tension. The sailors of the Baltic Fleet were not isolated from these changes. While Novik continued carrying out missions, the empire that had built her was beginning to fracture. In 1917, the Russian Revolution dramatically altered the fate of the Imperial Navy. Ships that once symbolized Tsarist power became contested assets between revolutionary forces. Novik survived the First World War, but its story did not end with the armistice. The destroyer passed through the turbulent transition from imperial rule to Bolshevik control, eventually becoming part of the newly formed Soviet Navy. Its name would change. Its flag would change. But the hull designed to be the fastest in the world continued to sail. This transition is a fundamental part of Novik's history, a warship conceived under the Romanov dynasty that went on to serve the emerging Soviet state, surviving one of the greatest political ruptures of the 20th century. The story of Novik is therefore not only technological. It is political. And above all, human, shaped by the crews who lived through war, revolution, and historic transformation aboard a destroyer that began its life as a symbol of imperial recovery. In 1917, as the Russian Empire began to collapse under the weight of war and revolution, the Russian destroyer Novik was still active within the Baltic Fleet. But the world around her was changing rapidly. The February Revolution, followed months later by the October Revolution, radically transformed Russia's political structure. The Imperial Navy, long loyal to the Tsar, became one of the centers of revolutionary unrest. Sailors of the Baltic Fleet played a significant role in the events of 1917 and were frequently associated with Bolshevik movements. Ships that had once symbolized imperial power now served a new regime. Novik did not escape this transformation. With the consolidation of Soviet authority and the reorganization of naval forces, the ship was incorporated into the newly formed Red Navy. In 1926, she was renamed Yakob Sverdlov, in honor of a prominent Bolshevik leader. The change of name represented more than a formal renaming. It symbolized historical rupture. The destroyer that had been born under the imperial banner now served the Soviet state. During the 1920s, the Soviet Navy faced enormous challenges. The Russian Civil War had exhausted resources, naval infrastructure was severely damaged, and many ships required extensive repair or modernization. The former Novik remained operationally valuable, but naval technology was advancing quickly. New destroyer designs were emerging across European fleets, and what had been revolutionary in 1913 was gradually becoming outdated. Even so, Yakob Sverdlov retained operational importance. She participated in exercises, patrol missions, and training activities within the Baltic Fleet. Her speed, once a world record, was no longer unmatched. Yet her solid construction and proven service history ensured continued usefulness. Throughout the 1930s, the Soviet Union invested heavily in modernizing its armed forces. The Navy underwent structural reforms, and older vessels slowly began to be replaced by more modern designs. Nevertheless, Yakob Sverdlov remained in service. Her hull, conceived during a period of imperial ambition, now sailed through an era of Soviet consolidation. The crew serving aboard her was no longer composed of sailors loyal to the Tsar, but of men trained under a new state ideology. The ship had become a silent witness to profound historical transformation. When the Second World War began, the Soviet Union was initially not at war with Germany. That situation changed dramatically in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa. The Baltic Fleet, including Yakob Sverdlov, would once again face German forces. This time, however, naval warfare had evolved. Aircraft now played a far greater role at sea, while submarines and naval mines remained constant threats. The aging Novik, though outdated by 1941 standards, still formed part of the Soviet order of battle. She would soon enter combat during one of the darkest periods in Soviet history. And once again, the Baltic Sea would become a battlefield, this time beneath the red flag rather than the imperial one. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, war arrived in the Baltic with brutal speed. The Soviet Baltic Fleet was immediately placed under intense pressure. Ports became targets of relentless bombing, sea routes were blocked by German minefields, and enemy air superiority made any naval movement extremely dangerous. The aging Yakob Sverdlov, once known as the revolutionary Russian destroyer Novik, now operated in a very different world from that of 1914. Naval technology had advanced. Warfare had become more mechanized, more aerial, and far more unforgiving. Although still operational, the destroyer was no longer a cutting-edge weapon. She was a veteran, durable, experienced but aging. During the first months of the German invasion, the Soviet Baltic Fleet faced an increasingly desperate strategic situation. Soviet forces were retreating on land, and pressure on Estonian ports grew rapidly. The evacuation of Tallinn in August 1941 became one of the most dramatic naval operations of the entire Baltic campaign. The withdrawal of Soviet ships and troops from Tallinn to Kronstadt took place under constant aerial attack and through densely laid German and Finnish minefields. Yakob Sverdlov was part of this desperate movement. The Baltic Sea had become saturated with mines. Navigation required absolute precision. A single deviation from the planned route could prove fatal. On August 28, 1941, during the evacuation, Yakob Sverdlov struck a naval mine. The explosion was devastating. The ship broke apart and sank rapidly. The destroyer that had once symbolized the technological revival of Imperial Russia, a vessel that had survived revolution, civil war, and ideological transformation, met its end not in a high-speed naval duel, but in a silent minefield. Modern war rarely offered dramatic or heroic confrontations. Often, danger came unseen, hidden beneath the surface. The loss of Yakob Sverdlov occurred amid one of the most costly evacuations in Soviet naval history. Numerous vessels were sunk by mines and air attacks during the operation. The narrow, heavily mined Baltic Sea became a deadly trap. The ship that had once been the fastest warship in the world ended its career immobilized by a static weapon, a mine. The historical irony is striking. Novik had been built to outrun opponents through speed. Her design embodied mobility and offensive action. Yet her fate came from the most impersonal threat imaginable. She was not defeated in pursuit. She was stopped instantly by an invisible explosion. Crew members were lost in the sinking, although exact casualty figures vary among historical sources. The chaos of the evacuation, simultaneous air attacks, and the scale of losses that day complicated accurate record-keeping. What remains certain is that the ship did not survive the crossing. Thus ended the career of a destroyer that had lived through 3 eras: the Russian Empire, the Revolution, and the Soviet Union at total war. From technological triumph in 1913 to the mined chaos of 1941, her story mirrors the dramatic transformation of naval warfare, and of Russia itself, across 3 turbulent decades. Yet the legacy of Novik extends far beyond her lost hull. Her design influenced an entire generation of Russian and later Soviet destroyers. The so-called Novik class became the foundation for future developments, helping establish the fast, heavily armed destroyer as a central element of modern naval fleets. She was a pioneer, a symbol, a witness to history. And her final resting place in the Baltic Sea marked not only the end of a ship, but the closing of an entire chapter in Russian naval evolution. The loss of Yakob Sverdlov during the evacuation of Tallinn did not erase the historical importance of the ship that had begun its life as the Russian destroyer Novik. On the contrary, its career became a powerful symbol of transition, technological, political, and military. When Novik was launched in 1911 and entered service in 1913, it represented something bold, a destroyer designed to push beyond the limits established by Europe's major naval powers. Its record-breaking speed, exceeding 37 knots during trials, was not merely an impressive statistic. It was tangible proof that Russian naval engineering could compete on the international stage. That achievement directly influenced the development of an entire generation of warships known as the Novik-class destroyers. Numerous vessels were built based on its design, adapted across different shipyards and regional specifications within the Russian Empire. These ships helped solidify the concept of the fast, heavily armed destroyer as an essential component of modern naval fleets. At the beginning of the 20th century, the role of the destroyer was evolving rapidly. Originally conceived to protect larger warships from torpedo boats, destroyers increasingly assumed offensive responsibilities of their own. Night torpedo attacks, advanced reconnaissance, and fleet escort duties became central missions. Novik stood at the heart of this transformation. Its exceptional speed allowed it to perform operations that slower vessels simply could not accomplish. In a confined environment like the Baltic Sea, where distances were short and control of narrow routes was strategically vital, this advantage carried real operational significance. During the First World War, Novik took part in operations against German forces, conducting patrols, escort missions, and offensive actions. It was not an isolated vessel but part of the broader structure of the Baltic Fleet. Yet its reputation for speed secured a distinguished status within the Navy. When the Russian Revolution completely reshaped the political system, the ship endured. Its name changed. Its flag changed. But it continued to sail. That continuity is remarkable. Few warships remain operational across three entirely different political systems. Novik served the Tsarist Empire, then the Revolutionary Navy, and ultimately the Soviet Union during total war against Nazi Germany. Across those decades, naval warfare itself underwent radical transformation. In 1913, aerial threats were virtually non-existent. Submarines were still emerging technologies. Mines were dangerous, but warfare remained largely two-dimensional at sea. By 1941, the situation had changed completely. Aircraft dominated the skies. Submarines had become mature strategic weapons. Minefields were vast and densely deployed. Radar was beginning to reshape maritime awareness. The ship that had represented technological supremacy in 1913 was now outdated by modern standards. Yet it remained in active service, fulfilling operational duties until the moment a naval mine ended its career. The explosion that sank Yakob Sverdlov during the Tallinn evacuation was more than a tactical loss. It marked the final chapter of an era that had begun under imperial ambition. The Baltic Sea, where Novik had first earned its reputation for unmatched speed, also became the place of its destruction. The vessel's full trajectory mirrors that of Russia itself during this turbulent period. Technological recovery after defeat, World War, imperial collapse, revolution, Soviet reconstruction, and ultimately total conflict in the Second World War. Novik began as a symbol of modernization and ended as a veteran of industrialized warfare. Between those two moments, the world changed. And the ship sailed through those changes, witnessing transformations that would redefine the 20th century. The influence of the Russian destroyer Novik extended far beyond its individual performance. Its design became a concrete reference point in Russian naval engineering. The so-called Novik-class destroyers, built according to its concept, represented a significant qualitative leap for the Imperial Russian Navy. These ships adopted elongated hull lines, modern steam turbine propulsion, and relatively heavy armament for their displacement. Rather than serving as purely defensive vessels, they evolved into versatile offensive platforms. In the context of the First World War, this meant the ability to conduct rapid attacks against larger enemy units, escort cruisers, and maintain an active presence in contested areas of the Baltic Sea. The speed achieved by Novik, exceeding 37 knots during trials, gained widespread international recognition. At that time, no other operational warship matched such performance. This achievement elevated Russia's technical prestige during a period when rebuilding military credibility after the disaster at Tsushima was a national priority. The destroyer became a symbol of recovery. Yet speed was not its only defining feature. The balance between mobility and firepower reshaped the evolving role of destroyers. Novik carried multiple medium-caliber guns and torpedo tubes, allowing dynamic engagement against lighter vessels while posing a serious threat to larger warships. In the confined environment of the Baltic Sea, where distances were short and encounters could occur suddenly, this combination proved particularly effective. When the revolution of 1917 transformed Russia's political landscape, the fleet itself became a strategic asset of the new regime. Baltic sailors played a significant role in revolutionary events, and ships like Novik continued service under a different flag. Its renaming to Yakob Sverdlov in 1926 formed part of Soviet policy aimed at removing imperial symbolism and reinforcing ideological identity. Behind the new name, however, the same hull remained. During the interwar period, the destroyer was no longer the fastest ship in the world. Naval engineering had advanced rapidly in Britain, Germany, Japan, and the United States. New destroyers achieved comparable or superior speeds, equipped with improved fire control systems and stronger anti-aircraft defenses. Nevertheless, the former Novik retained operational value within the Baltic Fleet. It served as a training platform and participated in maneuvers and patrol missions, representing continuity within the emerging Soviet Navy. By the time the Second World War reached Soviet territory in 1941, the ship was already a veteran of nearly 3 decades of service. The evacuation of Tallinn marked the final chapter of its career. The operation became one of the most dangerous naval movements in the Baltic during the war. Extensive minefields and relentless German air attacks turned the withdrawal into a scene of devastation. The mine explosion that sank Yakob Sverdlov ended not only the career of a single ship, but also the living legacy of an entire phase in Russian naval evolution. It had been born as a symbol of imperial modernization. It survived World War and Revolution. It served under a completely different political system. And it ultimately sank amid the industrialized warfare of the Second World War. Its history encapsulates 3 turbulent decades, where speed, innovation, political transformation, and total war converged within a single steel hull that sailed the Baltic Sea under 3 different flags. If we examine the Russian destroyer Novik from a broader historical perspective, it becomes clear that the ship represents a turning point in how destroyers themselves were conceived at the beginning of the 20th century. Until the late 19th century, these vessels were primarily viewed as torpedo boat destroyers, ships designed to protect larger warships from attacks by smaller torpedo craft. But with the introduction of steam turbines and rapid-fire light artillery, the destroyer began to develop an independent identity. Novik pushed that evolution to a new level. Its extraordinary speed was not merely a technical achievement. It reshaped naval doctrine. A ship capable of exceeding 37 knots could perform missions previously considered too risky or impractical. It could rush forward to launch torpedo attacks against superior enemy forces and withdraw before effective retaliation. It could patrol vast operational areas with unprecedented rapidity. In practical terms, this dramatically increased the tactical flexibility of the Baltic Fleet. During the First World War, Novik took part in operations against German naval forces in an environment already dominated by mines and submarines. Naval warfare in the Baltic was defined less by massive battleship engagements and more by blockades, skirmishes, and extensive mine warfare. Pressure was constant and attrition gradual. Within this setting, Novik served as an agile and adaptable instrument, frequently operating ahead of heavier formations. When the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, the Navy became a center of intense political upheaval. Many Baltic sailors supported revolutionary movements, and fleet units played symbolic roles in the events that ultimately brought the Bolsheviks to power. The destroyer, already established as a technological benchmark, survived this institutional rupture. Renamed Yakob Sverdlov, it continued service under the Red Flag, becoming part of a navy attempting to redefine itself amid civil war and international isolation. During the 1930s, as newer generations of Soviet destroyers emerged from modern shipyards, the former Novik remained a living link between the imperial past and the early modernization of Russian naval power. Its elongated silhouette and elegant hull lines were no longer cutting edge, yet they remained functional and reliable. When the Second World War erupted on the Eastern Front, the Baltic Sea once again became a critical strategic theater. Ports such as Tallinn and Kronstadt were essential to the defense of Leningrad. The Baltic Fleet operated under increasing German air superiority and the ever-present danger of naval mines. During the evacuation of Tallinn in August 1941, dozens of Soviet vessels attempted an extremely hazardous passage through dense German and Finnish minefields. The operation resulted in heavy losses. It was in this context that Yakob Sverdlov met its end. A mine explosion tore the ship apart, and it sank rapidly in the Baltic, the same sea where it had established its reputation nearly 3 decades earlier. There is deep symbolism in that conclusion. The ship once celebrated as the fastest warship in the world was ultimately immobilized by a silent, stationary weapon. Speed offered no protection against an invisible minefield. Yet its legacy did not vanish with the sinking hull. The Novik class influenced later Soviet destroyer designs and helped solidify the doctrine of fast, offensively capable destroyers that would become standard throughout the 20th century. Novik was more than a speed record. It marked a transition between eras. It witnessed the fall of an empire and the rise of another. And it sailed, under 3 different flags, through some of the most profound transformations in modern Russian history. The history of the Russian destroyer Novik must also be understood within the broader context of the naval arms race that defined the years leading up to the First World War. In the early 20th century, the great powers competed not only in the number of ships they possessed, but in technical performance. Speed, range, and firepower became direct measures of national prestige. When Novik exceeded 37 knots during sea trials, news of the achievement spread quickly among European naval observers. It was an extraordinary accomplishment. British and German destroyers of the period had not yet reached comparable speeds. Russia, only a few years removed from its humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, was now presenting a warship capable of surpassing its rivals in one of the most valued naval parameters of the era. The symbolic impact was immediate. Novik demonstrated Russia's ability to absorb and apply modern technology, particularly through the use of advanced steam turbines. The propulsion system was central to the ship's performance. These turbines allowed rapid acceleration and sustained high speeds, qualities essential to the increasingly offensive doctrine assigned to destroyers. Yet such speed demanded sophisticated engineering and constant maintenance. Sustained high-performance operations required heavy fuel consumption and imposed significant mechanical wear on critical systems. During the First World War, Novik operated in an environment where mines and submarines imposed constant caution. The Baltic Sea became a confined and dangerous theater filled with hidden threats. Naval warfare there rarely involved decisive fleet battles. Instead, it was characterized by attrition, blockades, patrol actions, and ambushes. Within this setting, the destroyer distinguished itself in operations against German forces, strengthening its reputation inside the Baltic Fleet. Its ability to reach strategic locations quickly made it especially valuable for patrol duties and escort missions. Following the Russian Revolution and the subsequent Civil War, the Navy underwent profound restructuring. The aging but still capable Novik continued service under the new political order. Its renaming as Yakob Sverdlov in 1926 was more than an administrative act. It formed part of a broader symbolic effort to align the armed forces with the Soviet regime. During the interwar years, even as newer destroyer classes entered service, Yakob Sverdlov remained operational. No longer the fastest warship in the world, it nevertheless remained robust, experienced, and reliable. When the Second World War reached Soviet territory, the Baltic Fleet once again faced direct existential threat. German advances endangered key ports and forced urgent naval evacuations. During the dramatic evacuation of Tallinn in August 1941, dozens of Soviet vessels attempted passage through dense minefields while under intense aerial attack, one of the most dangerous naval operations of the Baltic campaign. Yakob Sverdlov struck a mine during this withdrawal. The explosion shattered the hull and caused the ship to sink rapidly. The vessel that had once symbolized extreme speed met its end in a static minefield. This historical irony underscores the transformation of naval warfare across the decades. In 1913, speed represented tactical supremacy. By 1941, mines and air power could neutralize even experienced and well-designed warships. Novik began its life as a manifestation of imperial technological modernity. It ended as a veteran of industrial total war, lost in waters it had sailed for nearly 30 years. Between those two moments, it passed through empire, revolution, and global conflict, leaving a lasting mark on the evolution of Russian and Soviet destroyer design. The impact of the Russian destroyer Novik cannot be measured solely by its speed record or by the length of its operational service. It marked a specific moment in naval history when technology began to fundamentally redefine how wars at sea would be fought. At the beginning of the 20th century, battleships still dominated military imagination. They were giants of steel, built around heavy guns and thick armor. Yet ships like Novik demonstrated that mobility could be just as decisive as raw firepower. The fast destroyer became an instrument of asymmetry. Against larger and slower ships, it could choose when to attack. Against comparable opponents, it could dictate the tempo of engagement. In confined theaters such as the Baltic Sea, filled with narrow passages and restricted waters, this agility became even more valuable. During the First World War, the Baltic Fleet confronted the German Imperial Navy in an environment defined by constant surveillance and extensive mine warfare. Novik operated within this defensive and offensive network, protecting routes and carrying out rapid incursions. Naval warfare itself was changing. Mines emerged as a central strategic weapon. Submarines gained increasing importance. Maritime supremacy no longer depended solely on gun power, but on controlling sea areas through invisible barriers. Novik had been built for speed and maneuverability, yet throughout its service life warfare became increasingly three-dimensional, involving air, surface, and subsurface threats. By the time it was renamed Yakob Sverdlov, the ship already carried enough history to symbolize continuity between two political systems. Under the Soviet Union, it became part of a navy striving once again to assert itself as a significant regional force. During the 1930s, Soviet naval doctrine evolved, but the Baltic Fleet remained essential for the defense of Leningrad and control of maritime access to the Russian interior. The former Novik remained within this structure, even though it was no longer at the technological forefront. When Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, the Baltic quickly became saturated with mines and subjected to relentless aerial attacks. The evacuation of Tallinn in August 1941 revealed the brutality of this new phase of warfare. Yakob Sverdlov sailed among crowded convoys attempting to escape advancing German forces. The sea was heavily mined. Enemy aircraft struck repeatedly. The explosion that sank the ship was a direct consequence of modern industrial war, a conflict in which control of the sea depended not only on direct confrontation, but on denying operational space to the enemy. The destroyer that had once been the fastest warship in the world was ultimately defeated by a silent, invisible weapon. Yet its legacy had already been secured long before that moment. It proved that the Imperial Russian Navy could produce vessels of exceptional performance. It influenced subsequent ship designs. It served through 2 world wars and survived the collapse of an empire. From its launch in 1911 to its sinking in 1941, its career spanned 3 decades of technological and political revolution. Novik began as a promise of modernization. It ended as a witness to profound historical transformation, a ship that sailed through empire, revolution, and total war, leaving a lasting mark on destroyer development and on Russian naval history. If there is one thing that defines the Russian destroyer Novik, it is the contrast between its beginning and its end. It was born in a moment of imperial ambition. Russia was seeking to recover its prestige after the humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. The empire needed to prove to the world, and to itself, that it was still capable of cutting-edge naval innovation. Novik was a direct response to that need. It was not merely a fast ship, it was a public demonstration of industrial capability and strategic vision. When sea trials confirmed speeds exceeding 37 knots, the achievement resonated internationally. For a brief moment, no operational warship in the world could match its performance. It symbolized a future in which mobility would define naval combat. But the world changed rapidly. The First World War revealed that naval warfare no longer depended solely on speed or armor. Mines and submarines reshaped the balance of power. The Russian Revolution dissolved the regime that had built the ship. From the ruins of the empire emerged the Soviet Union, inheriting ships, shipyards, and sailors alike. Renamed Yakob Sverdlov, Novik became part of this new reality. It survived the turbulent years of civil war, joined the reorganization of the Soviet Navy, and continued sailing even as newer generations of destroyers were designed. It was no longer the fastest, no longer the most modern, but it was durable, experienced, a living link in the continuity of Russian naval history. By the time the Second World War reached the Baltic Sea, the ship carried nearly 3 decades of service behind it. The operational theater was saturated with mines, while German air superiority placed constant pressure on the Soviet Baltic Fleet. During the evacuation of Tallinn in August 1941, the retreat turned into a scene of chaos and destruction. Dense minefields, relentless air attacks, and crowded convoys attempting escape. It was there that Yakob Sverdlov struck a mine. The explosion allowed no heroic maneuver or high-speed escape. The ship broke apart and sank. The Baltic Sea, which had once witnessed its glory as the fastest destroyer in the world, became its final resting place. There is an unavoidable irony in this. The ship that symbolized the supremacy of speed was ultimately defeated by a silent, invisible weapon. The war it knew in 1914 was not the same war that destroyed it in 1941. The 20th century had transformed around its steel hull. Yet Novik's legacy endured. It redefined performance standards for destroyers. It influenced future naval designs. It served under 2 ideologically opposed flags. It fought through 2 world wars. It was both a product of the Russian Empire and an instrument of the Soviet Union. Few ships passed through so many historical eras while remaining operationally relevant. Novik was not merely the fastest warship in the world for a brief moment. It was a bridge between worlds. Between the Romanov Empire and the Soviet state. Between traditional naval warfare and total industrial war. Between technological ambition and strategic brutality. If you enjoy real stories like this, deep, detailed, and grounded in historical fact, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a like to support this kind of content and continue exploring the ships, battles, and people who shaped naval history. Because the sea preserves memories that outlast empires. And there are still many stories left to tell.